Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the 3 Eastern Provinces Republic of China Calendar Model 13 Mauser Nambu Rifle. Most people call it the Manchurian Mauser, and we'll explain the rest of whatever that was after we get this in the light box. With an overall length of 49.3 inches and weighing in at 8.5 pounds, this is a fairly standard Old World infantry Mauser, though it did appear a little late for that length. The magazine capacity is 5 rounds of the German 7.92 by 57mm cartridge, and of course it is fed via stripper clip. And just to be clear, this rifle should have a dust cover which is not visible in these photos, as they are unobtainium today. Our videos always do best with the general public when we have an easily recognized firearm, something everyone already knows, and yet I keep tossing in obscure and interesting pieces like this. This is obviously a losing business model, unless of course we happen to be primarily funded by you, the sort of person who wants to learn new things. Please consider supporting us for as low as $1 a month. It's basically free adjacent, and we really appreciate it. Some recurring support also comes from our already well-established favorite dual soldiers oil, Ballistol. Painted up like Christmas, this can contains a gift to every collector out there, a preservative fluid safe for wood, metal, and leather, and not at all toxic to yourself, though I don't recommend that. Don't forget, we have a standing challenge out there that anyone who buys it by the gallon or greater and sends us a publicly appropriate picture gets a feature on the show. I promise you'll use it all up faster than you think. And of course, when you order it, make sure to tell them that we sent you. Now, today's rifle is frankly quite a favorite of mine. On the surface, it's an unusual Mauser, much like the Thai that we've seen before. Yes, both are export pattern Mausers, at least in configuration and lockwork. They also both feature sliding dust covers, but most curiously, both seem to have been influenced by Germany, Japan, and Austria. The order, however, is a bit different between the two. Now, of course, before I get into the little details, we first have to understand the broader picture. Unfortunately, in this case, that will involve a very tumultuous period in history spread over frankly contentious boundaries. A casual conversation about warlord-era China could easily encompass an entire episode, so we're going to try and cover the absolute necessities. The last imperial dynasty of China was the Qing, ending with the Guangxu Emperor. During his rule, China struggled fiercely with foreign influence and even direct action. Reaching for a modern rifle, they adopted a 6.8mm smokeless magazine rifle in 1904, which was to be produced on contract in Japan. However, the Russo-Japanese War stalled this program and forced China to turn towards Germany, who, through Mauser, offered up an export pattern rifle, essentially Gewehr 98 infantry rifle, with a simpler forward barrel band and tangent rear sights. Uprising and then revolution in 1911 secured an imperial abdication in February of 1912, transforming China into a republic. So the Qing government came to be replaced by the Beiyang government. It's important to know going forward that the government and country are not the same thing throughout this story. And even within governments, there will be various factions. The new government kept the Mauser, which was actually now in just 8mm German. It was called the Type 1, or at least renamed the Type 1. The nascent Republic of China was fairly unstable, a massive land of varied peoples and ideologies. Large areas of the country were essentially loose coalitions of influential powers. Perhaps the most distinctly different region was what we in the West usually refer to as Manchuria, known in China at the time as the Eastern 3 Provinces, or just the Northeast. This region was home to the Manchu people, who had actually established the now defunct Qing Empire. With political change in the wind, many Manchus now felt a sense of Manchurian nationalism, distinct from China proper. Thankfully for the Republic, the political and physical force necessary for Manchurian independence just wasn't present in 1911. Instead, the regional government managed to maintain control with the help of a local commander named Zhang Zolin. Born in 1875 in Haicheng, part of the Fengtian province, and also known as Liaoning province, Zhang Zolin grew up in a poor peasant family. He was raised illiterate and without formal education. It's worth noting that despite being from the Manchurian region, Zolin himself claimed to be a descendant of the Han Chinese of Liaodong. As early as 1896, he had become a member of a regional gang of bandits. Being both a brawler and fairly quick-witted, Zolin managed to become the leader of his own small bandit army. In 1900, during the Boxer Rebellion, his forces were actually joined to the Chinese Imperial Army. This, of course, did not go well for China overall, and the central government was weakened significantly. This put even more power into the hands of regional pseudo-military groups like Zhang Zuolin's. In 1903, the Qing government actually recruited his still growing forces into the regular army. During the Russo-Japanese War, Zhang's men were hired as mercenaries by the Japanese army. The 1911 revolution, however, would launch Zhang Zuolin into a position of frankly impressive political power by taking an unusual stance. As we covered a second ago, there was a lot of interest in an independent Manchuria at the time of the founding of the Republic of China. Zuolin, however, used his authority and his troops to keep the three eastern provinces as exactly that, a region of China and not an independent nation, at least nominally. And in the first year, he wisely backed the real winner. Elected provisional president Sun Yat-sen and his associated revolutionaries were not able to consolidate power and had to negotiate with the former Qing and other powerful cliques. He would ultimately be displaced by Yuan Shikai, who controlled the Beiyang army. While we won't go into detail about his rule in China, I will say that Zhang Zuolin remained a supporter of Yuan Shikai's until his death. Using the unsteadiness of the new Chinese government and his fairly remote position, Zuolin further secured his authority over the three eastern provinces. In 1915, Yuan Shikai named Zhang Zuolin as the military governor of Fengtian. This was expanded to cover the role of civil governor as well in 1916. This was all part of buying Zhang's support for Yuan declaring himself emperor that same year. This lasted 83 days, launched a series of revolts, and came to an end with his death from uremia. Zhang Zuolin emerged unscathed with the restored republic government recognizing his status and even expanding it in 1917. Long story short, Zuolin plotted with Qing loyalist Zhang Zhun to attempt to forcibly restore Puyi, the last of the Qing emperors, a child at the time he was deposed. Zhang Shun entered the capital July 1st, 1917 and declared Puyi as the emperor of China, subduing the capital police. This resulted in a Republican counterattack which doomed the brief monarchist restoration. Curiously enough, Zhang Zuolin participated on the side of the Republic despite having encouraged Shun to take that said action. Following the failure of Puyi, the Anhui and Jili cliques came into direct conflict. Okay, this is going to get weird. Briefly, the Fengtian clique was the political/martial faction that backed our man, Zhang Zuolin, who was not at this time trying to control all of China. He was just doing his thing in Manchuria. The Anhui clique, named for many of its founding generals coming from Anhui, split from the Beiyang and were largely led by a man named Duan Qiri. Restoring the Republic, they came into conflict with the Jili clique, made up of officers who felt snubbed by Duan Qiri. Zhang Zuolin backed the Jili, and together they all but wiped out the Anhui, securing control of the central government. This allowed him to reap more rewards, securing governorship of Heilongjiang and Jilin. This was solidified with the title of Governor General of the three eastern provinces, which also granted him control over much of Inner Mongolia. Notable exceptions to his reach, however, must be mentioned now. Following the Russo-Japanese War, the Kwantung leased territory and its lovely port fell back into the hands of Japan. This was paired with the South Manchurian Railway, which passed through the city of Shenyang, which had its ancient name restored in 1914. Previously, it was known as Mukden. The land around the tracks was considered extraterritorial, controlled by the Japanese Kwantung Army, which had started as a security force. Zhang Zuolin wisely chose to work with his Japanese neighbors. He essentially kept walking a balancing beam, neither aligning completely with the Japanese army nor with the Chinese Republic, and yet paying deference to both. In this way, he could stall off either of these parties while bolstering the strength of his own three eastern provinces, which was nominally not independent, but still very independent. Hiring an excellent director for his Bureau of Finance, Zhang Zuolin's Manchuria went from deep debt, low population, and scant resources to an economic powerhouse. Migrant workers were encouraged, farmland was reclaimed, mines were opened up, the currency was backed by a silver reserve. Unlike central China, Manchuria improved rapidly, making it all but impervious to any assault from those forces to the southeast. In 1922, Zhang Zhoulin's Fengchang army was estimated at 100,000 troops. Unfortunately, however, he had no reliable supply of weapons. Like most of China, he had bought up stocks of World War I surplus from various nations, including some 30,000 rifles from the evacuated Czech Legion. This, of course, was not sustainable and introduced all sorts of ad hoc supply and training issues. The nearest and most interesting firearms supplier would be the Japanese, but they were hamstrung by an international embargo from 1919. Great Britain, Spain, Portugal, USA, Russia, Brazil, France, and Japan all signed. The Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, and Italy also agreed but were unable to sign at the moment of agreement. Under this embargo, only the official government of China could receive arms shipments. This, if honored for long, would have kept Zhang Zhoulin dependent on the central government arsenals or the black market. He, of course, made the necessary choice to establish an arsenal of his own. So, a massive area outside of Shenyang was earmarked for development. Period foreign reports suggest that it was 2 miles from the town walls and sprawled over a 3.5 mile square patch of land. It was directly connected to the railroad. Chief of Staff General Yan Yuting was appointed as director. A Shenyang native, he had studied at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, particularly in artillery. Many considered General Yan to have been the true talent behind Zhang Zhoulin. The massive facility was first noted in international reports in March of 1920. At this time, it was just an expansion plan with some $7 million to be invested in the sprawling works. Rifles, machine guns, small arms ammo, even artillery and mortars. Everything an independent country would need, if they ever wanted to do that or whatever. The official name of the arsenal, at least from establishment into the 1930s, was the Three Eastern Provinces Arsenal. Western writers usually just called it the Arsenal at Mukden. It was likely built over some existing repair facilities, and for some years the arsenal was expanded fairly ad hoc, resulting in a mix of old and new buildings and a wide array of both products and leadership. Advisors and employees were actually gathered from Japan, Russia, Britain, Germany, Austria, Denmark, and other countries. By example, the Kwantung Army actually wanted to help directly arm Zhang Zhoulin, but the Japanese government refused, as they would have to deal with violating the aforementioned embargo. So they limited themselves to helping establish ammunition production alone. A British expert headed up mortar production, and so on from there. The Danish firm Nielsen and Winther was responsible for setting up the rifle factory within the arsenal. While this company does have its own rich history in machine work, it's obviously not one familiar to us in the firearms field today. In China, however, they had brokered deals before, supplying machinery to the Hanyang arsenal back in 1911. Period sources suggest the purchase was made in 1921, with the Danish firm to receive some $3,900,000 payment with the completion of the works no later than June of 1922. We'll discuss the rifle itself in just a moment, because for now that deadline would not be met. Meanwhile, Zhang Zhoulin was playing a sort of Game of Thrones. Now in December of 1921, Zhoulin exerted pressure again in the capital of Beijing, forcing out the current premier and installing his own favorite, along with proposing a new constitution and financial reforms. This was done without approval from the Zili clique, and in the spring of 1922, the matter came to outright combat. The Three Eastern Provinces Army took Beijing in April, but in early May, the Zili army had successfully turned the tide. It was Zhoulin's loss. His response was to secure his borders and declare the Three Eastern Provinces as independent from Beijing. As a side note, his financial advisor, the one who had actually restored the Manchurian economy, fled to the Japanese for a time. He used this stalemate to negotiate with Zhang Zhoulin to reduce military spending and retract the then current martial law, which was hurting the province's future. His reforms to immigration and expansion of farmlands and even breaking the Japanese monopoly on textiles is worth a read, but we're here for the firearms. Defeat also lit a fire under the army. Training was expanded and solidified, more modern equipment like radios, machine guns, and even Renault FT tanks were snapped up as much as possible. Once more, the arsenal was expanded, ordnance began to flow into stockpiles, and tens of thousands of rifles were refurbished into usable arms. Moreover, the rifle factory was finally put into operation sometime in 1924. As for what they produced, well, of course it's going to be, this gun here. But where exactly did it come from? Recall the contract was with the Danish firm Nielsen and Winther. Well, they did business with an Austrian firm, the Böhler Brothers Company. These were the same bowlers as the famous barrel steel used not only during the war in Europe, but also the prime supplier of barrel steel to the Empire of Japan. Bowler, it seems, managed to lay hands on machinery and apparently plans from what remained of OEWG Steyr in Austria. Having supplied Austria-Hungary during the war, the Steyr plant was prohibited post-war from arms production and export. While the factory diversified, some of the now useless rifle-making machinery was sold off, and it seems likely that a whole rifle line and technical package was sold to Manchuria. The evidence is somewhat indirect. Various stray accounts, like the Kuomintang's Ordnance Director's 1934 report that explicitly states that the rifle was purchased from Austria, and an extremely strong resemblance between the Mauser I have here and an experimental rifle from OEWG Steyr, or at least its descendant. Oh boy, let me explain this. During the Great War, Austria-Hungary wasn't entirely happy with their 1895 Mannlicher straight pull infantry rifle. Apparently, they were considering a more powerful cartridge than the 8x50mm rimmed round-nosed cartridge. Likely the concern was for a Spitzer conversion, and if so, they may have been considering ditching the rim entirely. Rimless, however, was not the Mannlicher's strong suit, as it wasn't designed around gas mitigation and the like. OEWG had already been a producer of Mauser rifles for export. It wouldn't have been hard to make a switch, but that in turn meant abandoning the current available ammunition in the Empire. I have no idea how many circles this made, but the concern led to the development of an improved Austrian military rifle, likely known as a Model 17 for the year 1917. Unfortunately, I have no photos or drawings of that exact firearm. However, we do have drawings from its 1930 descendant. This comes from a 1930s Steyr Solothurn Waffen AG project. Having dusted off the 1917 prototype, it was adapted for a Spitzer cartridge and yet made use of existing Mannlicher clips by keeping the Mannlicher magazine. Frankly, I'm unsure if the Austrian Model 1917 did exactly the same or opted for a Mauser double stack. The bolt and lock work, however, are almost assuredly the same as the World War I prototype, a Mauser 98 derived system that seems to have been influenced by the Japanese Type 38 rifle. Those features being the sliding dust cover that rides with the bolt handle, and a firing pin spring set inside the firing pin itself, though that did exist on rifles before Nambu's work in Japan. The cocking piece was also sealed up, preventing dirt or mud from piling up between it and the sleeve. It seems fairly obvious to me that this was an attempt to create a Mauser derivative rifle that was better sealed for trench action. Unfortunately, in that war of attrition, it was just too much to introduce a new rifle into the fold. With Austria's post-war defeat, the project was abandoned, and like I said, sold to the Manchurian warlord. Fun fact though, the resurrected design was produced in Austria for troop trials in 1931. Though it performed well, there was no money in the budget for a new rifle. So, a simple Spitzer conversion process was carried out instead. Returning to Manchuria, or the three eastern provinces, they apparently received a technical package on that Model 17 along with their Austrian machinery. Set up an initial operation of the rifle plant was to be headed by a Danish engineer, listed in several foreign reports as either M.S. Schroeder or S. Schroeder. Regardless, the Austrian prototype rifle was modified to better fit the needs of the three eastern provinces. It took on the same stocking and hardware as the Chinese version of the Mauser 1907 export rifle. This was likely to make use of the existing repair facilities' experience and in parts and stock production. We also soon see a few additional changes were made to make the initial version of this rifle a bit more like the Japanese Type 38. These changes are credited to the new superintendent at the arsenal, Han Lin-chun. Another Manchurian native, he too had been educated in Japan and served the Chinese Ministry of the Army, becoming deputy chief of the army in the 1921 cabinet forced by Zhang Zhou. When that failed in the 1922 war, he was recruited by Zhou chief of staff for his role at the arsenal. Much like the Japanese Arisaka within the Fengtian army, many thought of this as the Han Lin-chun rifle. The modified rifle was chambered for the then standard German Spitzer cartridge. This was the same in use with the Republican government, and one of 3 cartridges in wide use within Manchuria at the time. The new rifle was designated Model 13, often translated as Type 13 in the West, likely due to the habit from Japanese collectors years ago. I suspect the use of type also kind of implies a non-Gregorian calendar, which is again what we have here. 1924 would be 13 years after the founding of the Republic of China's calendar. The rifle was paired with a knife-style bayonet seemingly patterned off of the Japanese Type 30. The blade is 11 1/8 inch long, and it sports a prominent quillion. As produced, it would be serial matched to the rifle. Alright, we have finally almost arrived at this rifle here. Thankfully, we're near enough that we can take a closer look anyway. Alright, we have a fairly long infantry rifle, and it's fairly shiny too. If we look up the front, we have a sort of armor level windage adjustable front sight pressed over the barrel, usual cleaning rod in place. We actually have sort of a Mauser 98 style of bayonet lock, although the band is a little older. We have a simple ring style with a flat spring that clicks on through the hole. At least in theory, it's trying to lose grip right about now. This little hook at the front is actually for carrying the rifle at sort of parade, so you would take up your whole sling and loop and lock. We see this on like the Norwegian Krag and other German Mausers. So if we bring this back, we'll see we had a half-length handguard, mid-position band, again spring retained. If we bring it forward, our handguard wraps all the way behind the rear sight. It's a fairly standard Mauser tangent rear sight. We'll look at that in just a second. And then if we go forward, we have a reinforcing lug through the stock. And here's our action. We'll of course see that in detail. Semi-pistol grip. And then rear swivel position that looks like it was set up to use a hanger. And of course, by the way, we had a short hanger position here too. And then if we get in the back, we have a standard steel butt plate with a bit of a tang up top, not much. No trap, no nothing fancy, no texturing even, very smooth. Our tangent rear sight is set up for 2,000 meters, marked actually in very familiar characters instead of the Chinese ones, probably a sign of modernization in Jiang Zhoulin's army. Now, you adjust this, of course, by pushing on your two buttons, rolling it forward, and that gets us our tangent profile for longer range shots. This does not use the export style single button click though. Once it's in position, we're good to go. You have to press both to move on down or up. The receiver is fairly blank, at least in terms of marking. There's a serial number on the side, and then of course this guy. The symbol is likely a stylized version of the character for East, the first character in the Eastern 3 Provinces arsenal. Of course, it's also made to look like a crosshair. We also have two gas escape holes. These would help vent in case of a ruptured cartridge and are a handover from Japanese influence. The overall action is not really any different than an export-style Mauser, especially one that's gone through the Austrian family of things, except a couple key differences. One minor one is that we have more of a olive-shaped bolt handle at the end here. This is, again, sort of Japanese influence. And if we look at the rear, we'll see that our cocking piece is completely enshrouded. Just to see that as clearly as possible, I have a 1912 export pattern from Austria, and you can see this cocking piece here sticking out from the cocking shroud. And you can't really see it here. You can maybe make out that sear back in there, or rather the lug for the sear. No. So this guy, perfectly exposed. We even have the little notch for catching it with the rim of the cartridge to recock it. So if I were to fire this gun, cocking piece goes forward and is down inside of there, and any mud or whatever can get in or out with it. If I were to fire the other rifle, you don't see anything, except for that my bolt handle was slightly out of position. So this is actually just a shroud. Continuing to work with our Austrian Mauser, if I bring this guy back and open up the bolt, I'll show you something kind of interesting, which is that I cannot rotate this cocking shroud or cocking piece, specifically because of, well, that little plunger there. This guy is not present on our Manchurian rifle. If I bring the bolt out and try to rotate this cocking piece, it's actually exceedingly easy to do as long as you go in the correct direction. As a matter of fact, this situation represents a huge pain to the shooter because you can no longer bolt it forward into battery, and if you try to, you're just going to tear up your stock and get nowhere. It's also really hard to get this back into play because you now must have to manually recock this cocking piece under spring tension by pulling it back and then rotating it into position. I've recocked it, and you may note there is no real positive detent in this position on the bolt body. So there's almost nothing resisting this thing rotating out of battery, which makes it exceedingly easy to have happen, even on accident. So this is considered a major design flaw of this rifle. But I kind of have a theory as to why this was allowed to happen. I suspect that according to the original design, the dust cover was supposed to retain the cocking piece shroud, because when we see examples of these guns with dust covers, which is really rare, they tend to go back far enough to partially cover it. And this whole rail system is set up to support that. We can see one groove here on the left side of the receiver, and the other is actually fairly exposed on this example because the wood unfortunately cracked away at some point. Originally, the wood would have actually supported it and shrouded it like in there and kept the dust cover from accidentally popping off. Now, we did not have an original dust cover to work with, so we endeavored to make our own. As a matter of fact, we made use of a piece of loaned equipment from Revware, their microscribe portable CMM. This allowed Bruno to take a number of data points from the receiver and create an accurate model of what the dust cover should be, at least based on the length that we assume from the photos that are available. Unfortunately, we do not have steel fabrication abilities, but we do have some friends that are capable of doing at least something with plastics. And so I have a slapdash piece of kit that was thoughtfully put together by our friends over at, well, C&Rsenal. Hopefully that shows the camera, if I could stop covering it up. No, I don't think they intended to steal part of our name, but you know, mimicry is a form of compliment, right? All right, so we have a dust cover. This is probably not quite the correct length, especially in this corner, and it suffers a couple of fitment problems in the fact that, unlike steel, it can't spring itself into position, so if I try to work the action, it's going to pop right off. And also, the thickness of the plastic means that it interferes with this screw right here for the bolt release. You can probably even see where it's shaved a little damage at the front, but you get the general idea. It's much like the Type 38 Arisaka in that it has, well, a cutaway here and it travels with the bolt handle at all times. Different is the fact that it has a step that would have been pressed into the design, which is also why it's so hard to duplicate, that covers the front of the receiver to make sure we seal this up. The reason that this step is necessary is because Mauser receivers have that step. Arisakas don't, or Nambu Type 38s don't. So, the one trick that I want to talk about, though, that I had him add to this design that is not present in the photographs that I know of the existing examples, is my theory for why they didn't have the out-of-battery safety on this piece. I had him turn down the rear and have it enshroud this cocking piece shroud. And in that way, the cocking piece shroud cannot rotate with the dust cover in place. That would be a very effective and inexpensive out-of-battery safety because you would just fit it into forming this sheet steel and therefore avoid using a plunger and spring and a matching cutout and all the assembly thereof, and frankly a cross pin to hold the plunger, blah blah blah, that went into keeping the Mauser 98 from doing the same. I am unsure if this was ever implemented in the 3 eastern provinces, but I suspect it was intended from the original Austrian prototype. It would certainly be a huge savings in the middle of the Great War. Now, even though this dimensionally looks more correct than anything I have available, it obviously can't be worked without things kind of going to pot. So, someone else stepped forward and gave us a little bit of hand on this project as well. Mark and Bruno got together and put together this. It's honestly thicker and heavier than it needs to be, and of course this attachment is not how it would have been. This is laid over and soldered. This is being formed as a pressing, but it allowed us to have enough rigid support at the back to do what I intended to show you, which is that we definitely have a way of retaining the cocking shroud. With our somewhat crude replacement part, we can show that, like the Type 38, it stays with the bolt the entire time the gun is operated. And if we have this out of lock at the rear and we attempt to rotate our cocking piece, I got nothing. Now, of course, if this were thin sheet steel, you could really bend on it and put it out of sorts if you wanted to, but you would have to try, really try, versus just accidentally knocking it like as possible as it is. Now, again, I have no primary evidence on this because I don't have access to the prototype 1917. I don't have access to factory fresh Type 13 rifle. And honestly, almost all the Type 13s that we know of have clearly been reworked at some point in their history, so we're not even sure that the few dust covers we've seen are the original dust covers and not some sort of later ersatz version or replacement version. It's really up in the air, but this is just something I like to consider that would solve a very odd omission if otherwise left alone. Disassembly of the bolt is fairly simple. We just go ahead and flip that flag safety up, and we'll use our bolt release lever here. So open her up, flip that lever out, bring her on back. That's just like a Mauser 98. For the Mauser 98, we have to work that aforementioned plunger. See it in there? It's got its little cross pin and spring and plunger, and it's got its own little housing on there that stands out. See the asymmetrical nature of it? Yeah, all that. So we push that, we start rotating. And as we do, it unthreads from the bolt body. So there's threads down in the bolt body, and they're matched by these guys here at the back of this extension off the cocking shroud. All right. For our Manchurian, we just rotate because none of that exists. As a matter of fact, the threads don't either because we rotate until we stop and then we yank free. Instead of any sort of threading back here, we actually just have a ring that's been milled around the back of the bolt body that has an opening on one section. That's how we get in there, twist, and we're locked in. This is actually a lot simpler. Looking at the Japanese Type 38's bolt, we can see that if we depress the safety and rotate until we're free, it uses a similar system. Look at that. We have a raised ring that works around, well, this is a safety slash plunger for the back of the firing pin spring, but you get the idea. This idea came from the Japanese. If we look at the firing pin, by the way, we'll see that it is a, well, limitedly perforated, hollow-bodied firing pin with its spring inside. That will look very familiar on our Mauser right here, although we have more perforations for oil and bleed off of gases. If we look at the Mauser, of course, the spring is wrapped around the firing pin. So again, we're borrowing from the East. Although this was part of the Austrian prototype, I suspect they were working off of a Type 38 as well. That gun, as we've said in this show, was pretty well set up to be a trench rifle. It just wasn't in Europe in large numbers, well, other than in Russia at that time. Further disassembly of the bolt is a little bit unusual coming from the Mauser, because normally you would depress the firing pin up to get the cocking piece back and then rotate it out, either keyed or screwed, depending on your Mauser model, to get it out the back of the cocking shroud. That's impossible in this case because of, well, this shrouding at the back of the shroud. Well, okay, there's two shrouds. I can't help it here. Now, in order to solve this conundrum, it's actually keyed so that if we were to compress our firing pin and flip our safety down to the correct position, this will allow the whole thing to come apart. It's a little bit difficult to show on camera, but I will endeavor to do so. We'll push in, we'll flip over, and then we'll release. And we're free. Once again, our spring is set inside the firing pin, clearly influenced by the Japanese, and yet modeled after the German/Austrian. That is a pretty fun little hybrid, especially when you see it all compared together. Looking closer at the cocking shroud, we'll see that it has a long pin that goes down the center, fairly thick. That guy's designed to put pressure on the back of the firing pin spring and is attached actually all the way at the rear where it's been ground off. And that rear section of cap, though it might look like a separate piece, is actually integral all the way back, and it only just has a groove cut in it. This little sliding/rotating cover is a second element that we'll talk about in a moment. But while we're looking at that pin, I just want to point out, boy, that's really familiar. A pin that runs all the way through and then was ground off, and then actually this guy was beautifully checkered radially at the rear, making them seem like one integrated piece. Yeah, again, same influence. You get the idea. Now, the cover here rotates specifically so that you can align it on the other side. So, see, we've got the groove cut all the way through. We're supported on both sides of the rear that holds the, this gets weird. But in this position, if you get it just right, you can actually get the safety out, although that is, there we go, that's the correct alignment. so then our safety can come on out and we can fully disassemble this guy. It's actually a very ingenious system, and I want to point out once again what we're looking at is a World War I prototype trench rifle from Austria-Hungary that made its way into China/Manchuria and therefore was further developed by modeling it after a longer stocked export pattern Mauser. But in reality, all these little fiddly bits that we're really enjoying so much are Austrians engineering Japanese solutions during the Great War, which is absolutely phenomenal. I mean, think of all the prototype rifles we've never seen or maybe even never heard of, and yet here's one on our hands because it happened to be sold off to a very ambitious, pseudo-independent, almost country. Now, despite how interesting this rifle may seem, its operation doesn't differ much from the German 1898, so I'd recommend checking our episode on that particular rifle for any details on how this works. The big differences will just be the extra shielding and the firing pin spring configuration. I will say the original version of this rifle, as this is the second version, did have one big mechanical difference, but we'll get there in a moment. First, let's go ahead and get this in Mae's hands for a practical demonstration. Now, you might have noticed that I kept our most functional and yet not entirely accurate dust cover on for that presentation. I like reminding people these guns are presently incomplete in our market. Entering production in 1924, the Model 13 was just in time to maybe join the new war effort because that fall fighting broke out again in China. This time the remnants on the Anhui clique refused to cede authority over Shanghai to a Zhili general. Zhang Zhulin was happy for an excuse to see a rematch. All the hard work and focused on improved equipment paid off well. The Fengtian army was able to gain the upper hand quite well without going into detail. Zhang Zhulin's forces were able to best the Zhili throughout northern China. While the conflict was largely resolved by November, there was some sporadic fighting well into 1925. Zhang Zhulin's coalition would install Duan Zhili, yes, the man he previously forcibly removed, as premier of China. As the new chief executive of the republic, he was, however, now just a figurehead, as his Anhui clique had all but been destroyed, and their major resources were gifted to their ally, the Fengtian clique. The real power was held by Zhang Zhulin and another warlord that we'll cover in a moment. By this time, Zhulin's 3 eastern provinces had further expanded in power, fully capable of rivaling China proper, even on one of its good days. Its geographic isolation, however, made it even more internally stable and unified. Compared to other warlords, Zhang was also still friendly with the Japanese, who provided critical intelligence and support in his battles throughout China. Externally, one might call him a Japanese supporter, but it seems more likely that he was using their support to both preserve Manchuria and hopefully one day reestablish the Chinese monarchy. He now had to share authority, however, with a Russian communist-backed Christian-friendly leader from the northwest of China, Feng Yuxiang, who had betrayed the Zhili clique during the preceding war, securing a sudden and strong victory for the Fengtian and now defunct Anhui. Feng's army was reformed as the Guominjun, and he was given great influence in the reformed government, at least for a time, as his home provinces, however, were nowhere near as secure or prosperous as Manchuria, meaning the balance would not last long. Politics began once again, and in October of 1925, a division commander of the Fengchong clique defected to the Kuomintang, laying siege to Shenyang, aka Mukden, home of our arsenal. As fighting expanded, the Zhili clique surprisingly came to the aid of Zhang Zhoulin's forces, mostly because of their fury at the Kuomintang's betrayal. Better to back a former enemy than a turncoat. Zhang Xuelang, son of Zhang Zhoulin, led his own army to occupy the capital, sacking it and leading to the collapse of most of the Beiyang government. The Kuomintang were summarily defeated in the spring of 1926, with only a remainder surviving in the northwest. The Zhili were weakened, leaving Zhang Zhoulin the most powerful authority in the whole of China, at least for a time. He continued to expand his base, again investing in the three eastern provinces' arsenal. Factories were added, now endeavoring to produce copies of the Japanese Type 3 heavy machine gun and the Type 11 light machine gun. Artillery and shells were also rolling off the lines. Specific to rifles, however, production was well below expected, and it's unlikely very many had served in the past 2 years. The trouble seems to have been a lack of technical staff, poor materials supplied, and corruption by the officers in charge. Very loose production numbers have been suggested by Stanley Zielinski based on estimates from various period reports. From 1924 until 1926, production likely hovered around 6,000 rifles a year. This was accelerated in 1927 to 20,000, which lasted through 1929. The change was made possible by additional purchases from Austria. Steyr foreman Hans Kunz would spend 2 years perfecting the installation. It has been suggested that this is also likely an explanation for several changes that were made to the Model 13 rifle. My later example has a step here, just behind that muzzle, and back near the rear sight, we have another step up. These two replaced a gentle sort of pencil-style taper that had previously been on the rifles. These little step-ups allowed for better heat expansion, like we saw on many Mauser rifles before, and therefore provided more precision over sustained shooting. This was a big improvement. If I walk her forward, we can also get a closer look at our trigger system, which is very much Mauser 98 on this late pattern. However, earlier versions borrowed from the Type 38. In this system, we have a forward pin with a spring wrapped around it. So when we pull the trigger, the sear drops at the rear, goes up at the front, spring pressure reasserts the system. That much is the same as the Mauser 98 style that we see in the later Manchurian, right? Up, down, except for we have a spring in a bucket. Now, externally, that's not a big difference, but internally, it does represent the biggest change between the early and late Model 13s, because on an early 13, in this system, that pin actually does penetrate into the receiver, and it's meant to rise into a groove that's milled into the bolt body, so that, if I were to put this bolt in the gun, we cannot actually pull the trigger all the way through with the gun out of battery. If I drop this guy in all the way, but not quite, we're locked up. Gun doesn't fire until we're in battery and there's room for it to do its thing. That same safety system would have been present on the early Model 13s and yet was later abandoned for a German style, likely because of the involvement of more Austrian engineers. Another change that seems to appear is this little marking, which can be found in front of the serial number or up on the chamber, and I believe a couple other places on these guns and bayonets. It is believed that this was either added with the change in production or that it was retroactively applied to rifles that came in under repair, or perhaps both. Regardless, it's often missing on the earliest of the Model 13s. At least one rifle has turned up with a shorter, simplified dust cover as well, however that might have been an ad hoc solution at the time. All of this strengthening of the arsenal was very necessary because despite basically conquering China, Zhang Zhoulin was overstretched. First, his financial expert had finally given up and left him. Now no one stopped Zhoulin from plundering the budget for ever-expanding military expenditures. This collapsed the Manchurian economy. Meanwhile, all the Republican clique infighting had given breathing room to the Kuomintang, the political descendants of the 1911 revolution and Sun Yat-sen. Now led by Chiang Kai-shek, Commander-in-Chief of the National Revolutionary Army, the Kuomintang were also now Soviet-supported, though it was a tense relationship at best. From the summer of 1926 until the end of 1928, the KMT pursued what's known as the Northern Expedition. This was a massive two-stage march across mainland China, with Zhang Zhulin and his three eastern provinces the most powerful oppositional force. The simplest way I can tell this story is that much of Zhang's fighting and therefore service for our rifle today was focused on defending Beijing from the KMT forces. Over numerous battles and maneuvers, ground was slowly being lost, which prompted the Japanese to declare that any fighting in Manchuria would result in their intervention. Despite this being a theoretical shield for Zhang Zhulin, it was actually something of a death nail. He rebuked the Japanese claims on Manchuria, but in doing so, exposed that he personally would not be saved by them. Combined with the strain of war, this collapsed the morale of his army, leading to a retreat. Gradually withdrawing back towards Manchuria, Zhang evacuated from the front by train on June 3, 1928. The next day, as his train passed over a Japanese-controlled bridge on the rail line, a bomb was detonated. Japanese Colonel Daisaku Komoto had assassinated Zhou in order to install a leader more sympathetic to the Japanese interests. The Japanese Kwantung Army had been grooming Yan Yuting for this role. However, even the Japanese leadership was caught off guard by the colonel's plan. Without a story in place, domestic and international outrage was clearly pointed at Japan, rightfully so. Zhou son took his father's place and signed an armistice with the Kuomintang, declaring that he would not interfere with the reunification of China. The Japanese wanted him to officially declare autonomy, but he refused. With this concession, China was officially in one piece again, though in reality, Manchuria was again acting on its own interest. Rifle production rose further in 1930 and was doing well into 1931. Obviously, Manchuria needed more than ever to defend itself. The massive arsenal was now capable of producing just about as much war material by itself as all the other Chinese arsenals combined. A mighty feat, but also a tempting target. The central government, of course, was unhappy about this. Also, Manchurian finances were still in disarray. So, agreements were made to slowly step down arms production and switch to civilian goods. This plan was never actually carried out, though, as the Japanese Kwantung Army interrupted in 1931. On September 18, 1931, an explosion was set off alongside the Japanese-controlled South Manchuria Railway near Shenyang, or Mukden. This was, of course, a false flag attack that Japan arranged and then blamed on Chinese dissidents. The next day, the Japanese army invaded Mukden. Within 5 months, all of Manchuria was in their hands. It was renamed to Manchukuo, the Manchu country. Zhang Shuilang had actually ordered his men not to fight the Japanese invasion, likely realizing they were no match for the better trained and equipped invaders. The constant fighting in China had also placed Zhang's back towards the Japanese territory and Korea. It would be nearly impossible for him to move his Western troops back to where they were needed in time. Also, because of Japanese advisors thus far, almost every bit of the Manchurian army was well understood by the Japanese planners. They couldn't pull any tricks. At the time of the attack, Shuilang was actually in Beijing trying to raise money for tens of thousands of refugees from the severe flooding that year. Criticism of his lack of resistance was severe and was even magnified by Japanese propaganda, who wanted to secure rule in the territory. Now, production of a rifle ended with the Japanese invasion. It's believed that roughly 140,000 had been completed by this point. The arsenal itself would be reworked by the Japanese, becoming their own Ho-Ten arsenal and producing Japanese armaments. Service life for this rifle, however, had just begun. Part of Zhang Shuilang's decision to surrender the Japanese invasion was to preserve as many of his own troops as possible for his own remaining ambitions. Still considered a Chinese army, he managed to maintain a fair bit of influence using his troops in Chiang Kai-shek's fight against the communists. Unfortunately, many felt the Generalissimo was too obsessed with those communists and not interested enough in expelling the Japanese. So in April of 1936, Zhang Shuilang took part in a plot to kidnap Chiang Kai-shek, forcing him to agree to a united front with the communists against the Japanese. While he did concede, he held a grudge against Shuilang. Having him arrested, trialed, and stripped of his civil rights, his forces were folded into the National Army, and along with them came their rifles. Back in Japanese-controlled Manchukuo, nearly 73,000 rifles, just under half of estimated production, fell into Japanese Kwantung inventory. These were likely used with locally raised troops until they could be replaced by the Type 38 Japanese rifle, which entered production at the former 3 Eastern Provinces arsenal. Some Mauser 13s have even been found converted to the 6.5 Japanese cartridge. A good many of these original 8mm rifles ended up in the hands of Mongolian troops, most directly with the Mongolian Independence Army, a force made up by the Japanese out of ethnic Mongols in Manchuria recruited from bandits and criminals. This force was initially directly under Japanese control, but was later folded into Manchurian army, mostly serving as cavalry. At formation, the force received some 3,000 Model 13 rifles. Similar but distinct was the Inner Mongolian Army, which had formed around a core 900-man bodyguard force for Chinese-Mongol Prince Dai Wang. Way back in 1929, Zhang Shuilang had gifted him rifles and other equipment for his men as a sign of friendship. The prince would later seek help from the Japanese in his battles with Yan Xishan of Shanxi. Later, the Japanese would place him as head of state for the Mengjiang United Autonomous Government. This was another Japanese puppet established in Inner Mongolia in 1939. Over time, his forces were apparently outfitted with upwards of another 10,000 Model 13 rifles. These were largely used in anti-bandit, counter-guerrilla, and police operations in support of the Japanese during the Second World War. Because this rifle was fielded by the Manchurians, Mongolians, nationalists, and even captured and reissued by the communists later on, it's fair to say that they saw a lot of hard use and heavy wear. One example has even turned up converted to 7.62 by 39 for use by the post-war Communist Militia Training Program. We usually find this as a modification for the Type 38 rifles, by the way. Frankly, it's nearly impossible to find a completely serial-matched Model 13 rifle, and most exhibit signs of parts replacement. Dust covers, of course, were almost universally lost. So despite the missing bits in varied numbers, I'm happy to say that we have this one here in such good shootable condition. That way, we were able to let Mae take it out for a round, and now we can get her opinion on how it handles. All right, once more, we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And we have the gun with the most confusing name ever.
What is it?
Okay, so...
Because I recorded Type 13, and then is it the Manchurian Type 13, or Model 13, or...
The gun has had so many names over the years. Most people call it a Manchurian Type 13.
Okay.
But technically... Type is just a thing that worked its way into the vernacular because of the Japanese collectors.
Yeah.
And all it ever meant was model.
Right.
But then, model always implies a Gregorian year. So I kind of like using type when it's a non-Gregorian year. Okay. I actually would prefer to use type for, let's say, Middle Eastern rifles that have non-Gregorian calendars.
That would track.
I think it kind of communicates something, right?
Okay.
So then, okay, well, now we're calling it model. And it's Manchurian, but then Manchuria wasn't... A lot of people, actually Chinese people, do not generally like Manchuria as a term. They think of it as a Western term for a region that was always China.
Right.
But they also tend to think Taiwan was always China. So it gets political almost.
Right.
At the time, Manchuria was operationally independent, and yet said that they weren't. So they called themselves the Three Eastern Provinces. So it's a whole mess. But we all know what we're talking about, at least. And I think for Western vernacular... If we're calling it a region and not an independent government and it's not making anybody mad, I think we can just go with Manchurian and we can go Type or Model 13. I don't think anybody cares.
Sure. I mean, I don't.
Yeah. So it's always fun when our episodes from the 20s and 30s end up being somehow intersecting with modern politics. But let me hand this over to you.
Thank you.
And let's walk through what it's like ergonomically to handle this gun that is so incredibly distinct and different from everything you've seen before.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how distinct and different it's going to come out sounding like, because everything about this screams Mauser, with the exception of maybe like the shape of the bolt handle here. It is not quite as
got a
bold.
little acorn shape to it.
Yeah, it's more acorn than cherry, which is what we're used to on Mausers.
Hold on, I got something right here. Let's see if I can help this situation. I just found it on the back wall.
Okay.
This is this should be, I believe, hold on, let me double check. Yeah, this is our 1907 export that for some reason had a turn down bolt in it. That drove us crazy at that time. So let's put these together.
Okay.
Yeah, other than the bolt handle we just mentioned, you got any differences for me?
No, because we've got tangent, leaf, rear sight, partially extended barrel. They're long, they're heavy. Even the barleycorn front sight is the same. Mauser style action, Mauser style safety, Mauser style freaking bolt releases on them.
Yep.
what am I missing here that's supposed to be a major difference? Other than maybe, like I said, the shape of the bolt handle and the fact that we have some gas relief here, which is actually not very common on the Mauser.
Right. And if you're very eagle-eyed, you would see the fact that they've shrouded the cocking piece.
Yes, you're right. That is bulbousy and weird looking by comparison, but they have protected the cocking piece there. I'm guessing it's for some sort of gas protection or something.
Now, the reason these two guns look so much alike is that the one in your left hand is actually modeled after the one in your right hand in terms of its skin. Like the stocking, the sling swivels, the sights, all that stuff. They copied what was being called the Type 1 in China, and the Type 1 in China was a clone of the export Mauser that we have in our hands. So that's the tangent, sights, everything. The actual action of that gun, despite looking like a Mauser 98, which you guys saw earlier in this episode, is not a Mauser 98 action. Not really. Because they've completely changed how the cocking shroud disassembles from the bolt. They've not completely, but they've heavily changed the firing pin to have an internal recoil spring or firing pin spring. And then, like I told you before, they've shrouded up the action. The safety actually retains the firing pin. That's totally different.
Oh, yeah.
And on the earliest version of that, it had the same out of battery safety as a Type 38, which actually, from what I've been able to see of the drawings that we have available to us, was not a feature of the prototype rifle from Austria. Although, I want to remind you, that is from guesswork. We only have drawings of a rifle based off of the prototype rifle that was used later in Austria. And then we have this rifle that was based off the prototype rifle that was used in Manchuria. We don't actually have the drawings of that prototype rifle. So Austria could have made further changes or reset changes on that gun when they did their 30s version of the gun that we saw in the drawing I showed you earlier.
Okay.
So actually, from my perspective, I don't know if anybody's turned up documentation. From my perspective, I don't have drawings of the very original prototype rifle. I don't even know if it was long or short or what. I can almost guarantee you it didn't look like that pattern. It probably would have been an H-band and everything that Austria was already doing. But this is where we are. This is what we know, right?
Okay.
What you're missing from that gun that would make it look different from this one?
Dust cover.
Dust cover.
Dust cover would be a huge sign that I would immediately, of course, with the dust cover on this one specifically, I would think, oh yeah, this is very Japanese of them because it goes with the bolt.
And in that regard, it reminds me a lot of, here, let me put this away so we don't get too confused. It reminds me a lot of the Thai Mausers that we saw, which were, confusingly, they were Mausers that were made in Japan and were based on an Austrian cartridge with a manually slid dust cover instead of just actuating with the bolt. And then now we have an Austrian gun based off of a German Mauser that then goes
weird
to Manchuria via the Dutch. Like it's I'm sorry, the Danes. I'm sorry.
The other D.
Yeah. So, wow.
Yeah.
But it is curious that both of them have the same influences and come up with kind of radically different solutions, although they're still Mauser 98 style actions.
Oh, yeah.
Is there anything about this in terms of handling that stands out from the previous gun without a dust cover on it?
The major one for me was frankly just how rough this piece felt when it came to handling the action. I mean...
How's that bolt?
It's very clunky. It's very grindy. Weirdly, I do wish they had made this acorn a little bit larger because it is a little too...
It's small. It's smaller than the ball.
Tiny that I care for.
It's smaller than the plum shape on Arisaka.
Yeah.
It's smaller than...
This might be the smallest one I've ever had.
It is. It's pretty small.
I'd like to do a comparison actually with calipers, but yeah, this has to be the tiniest one I've ever experienced.
Small and sharp.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a little uncomfortable actually. Loading was pretty much the same on handling the function with the actions. Stripper clip, no real difference there. But literally, I could tell. I try to go easy on pieces because some of them really kind of like gentler handling kind of thing. But this one likes it rough. It really does.
Well,
if I tried to go gentle on it, it was not going to feed properly. So I actually had to slam it home every time and then pop the action with significant force each time. Now, it functioned. It worked. We did a whole shoot with it, but not my favorite, just how much force was really required to work it.
I wanted to make the excuse that these guns are they've been rebuilt a number of times. The parts aren't necessarily matched. I mean, almost none of them are matching. And it's funny, but while we're filming this episode, I don't think I've ever full stripped this gun before other than to show you guys what was going on with it.
Yeah.
And I just took it for granted, like every other Chinese gun I have, it was going to be mismatched. And no, there's not a single mismatched number on this. This is an all matching type. This is an all matching type 13.
I understand that's actually unusual.
Yeah, it's not the norm. So fitment is exactly as it should be.
So this is how it should be, and it's not in terrible condition.
Right, so our excuse is, well, then this one probably went to the Chinese militia program, so it just got beat up on. It's real loose. It's not loose.
No.
And there's no, like, you guys know, guns that went through the Chinese militia program, the bore is gone. I mean, just shot through by tens of thousands more than they needed to be. The bore's fine on this one. I wouldn't say it's great. You know, this is...
And we use Ballistol on range to get a little bit of lubrication in there. It's still...
If this were like a German Mauser from World War I and we were a collector, we'd rated it like a 7 out of 10. Mm-hmm. But being a Chinese rifle... That's the highest mark.
Yeah, it might be a 10 out of 10.
Yeah,
it's a 10 out of 10. I can't think of a better...
If it had the dust cover, if it didn't have that chip of wood out of there from probably how it lost its dust cover.
I still consider it a 10.
It's just...
It's a Chinese rifle. It came out, it functioned.
So it's kind of likely that grittiness, it was just endemic to the system because it is oiled and clean.
Right.
So...
Ooh, okay.
But how did it shoot otherwise?
Throwing it up on my shoulder... The bounce is a little further forward than I really care for. I tend to prefer my rifles to be a bit shorter, but it's okay. But it's expected of a long Mauser, I guess.
That was in vogue at the time.
Yeah. And then semi-pistol grip, which is really nice. Thoroughly enjoy those. They come in handy. I think they just make the whole grip very comfortable. And the wrist itself, it's middle ground, not too narrow, not too wide. It's all right.
Certainly hasn't shattered.
No, it definitely has not, which is impressive and surprising.
Although, I want to point out while we're talking about it, we do have a notch. I don't know if I showed this earlier.
The second notch. Was that like a safety or something?
No, the notch in the wood right here?
Yeah.
That's from the side of the cocking shroud striking the bolt when it turned out a battery on some poor sucker.
That's funny.
I mean, it's got to gouge exactly where you'd expect it because guess what happened? The thing that happens.
Yeah,
anyway.
Okay. That's funny. Well, lining up my sights, this decent V-notch rear with barleycorn front, it's actually a clean read. Mm-hmm. The trigger from there, it's a pretty straightforward 2-stage. I mean, it's not the cleanest, lightest first pull through, but it's middle road, I would say.
Having shot this, I would say that I thought if you just hand it to me blindfolded and have me shoot it, or even not blindfolded, if I just didn't look at it closely.
It's Mauser export. Like, there's nothing that's fresh about it.
I would think that you had handed me, like, the Brazilian 1907 or the Chilean 1912, those export Mausers.
Yeah.
I would have thought it was one of those that needed a cleaning.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point, because everything about it, cycling the action, pulling the trigger, it feels so gritty that I'm thinking, it's either mismatched or this needs a little bit of polish.
Right.
Those would be my instincts. And then when I effectively get to recoil, I mean, it's 8mm Mauser. That's when we get to feel a little bit of a difference because there's a little more recoil. But
right, you would swear it's the 1907.
Right, but then I go to
boom.
the actual boom, and I think, oh well, this is more like Gewehr 98, but not with a Longa-Vizir sights. I know personally, I like Longa-Vizir sights.
You're the weirdest person on earth, but go ahead.
I like the look of them. However, objectively speaking, these are superior sights for that.
I want to remind you, we've said this on the export Mauser. These are the sights that Mauser wanted to sell the German government, but they forced him on the Longa-Vizir, which was just a bad decision.
I know, he was so unhappy.
And then, honestly, from shooting it, could you detect a difference in the firing pin, a difference in the way the action sealed? And then we actually used our impromptu dust cover.
Which worked fairly well.
Yeah, Mark and Bruno threw this together. It's not the right dimensions exactly, but we really wanted to work the gun with the dust cover. We really
wanted to see if we get that feel.
Well, that's not even that. This is the difference, right? This is the one external thing that will tell you that it's not the export Mauser.
Right.
But this is not the factory one.
Right.
Did it bind?
No, actually, surprisingly, it didn't bind. It actually felt pretty okay. It followed the bolt handle well itself. I didn't really feel like I snagged on that at all.
We fitted this without lubrication, by the way.
Right.
Because, again, we wanted to kind of get a feel for field conditions on this one.
Correct.
The gun should be lubricated, but I have a feeling very little lube would have stayed in these rails.
Oh, yeah.
So we just ran it, and it seemed perfectly operable.
Perfectly reasonable.
Okay. So with all that in mind, I guess would you take it over an export Mauser?
I mean, it's 8mm, so it's better stopping power. I can't argue with the improved cartridge.
Yeah, but we've been 7mm fans for a while. I don't think there's anything... 7mm has everything you need. I don't know why I'd prefer 7mm, to be honest with you.
I mean, that's fair. The recoil itself is more manageable, and in general, there's a lot more pieces that we have available at that time that use 7mm. I mean, unless I was concerned for something like gas mitigation and would go for this one over those. But otherwise, the Mauser exports, probably, you're not wrong, the 07 or the 12 would be pretty superior.
I'm in a weird position because it depends on what we're talking about. If we're talking about regular use conditions,
yes,
there's not much of a reason to choose this or the export Mauser.
Correct.
However, working from the Austrian prototype features, shrouding the cocking piece, reducing the number of parts in the bolt, relying on the dust cover to handle out a battery, we think. That's a theory of mine, but I'm just going to take it.
Interesting, okay.
Oh, I guess you haven't seen that footage
No.
yet. No, so that cocking shroud can rotate out a battery unlike a regular Mauser 98, which is how the gouge got there. I believe the original design, I don't know if Manchuria ever did this, but I believe the original design without access to it, I can't imagine the Austrians making this mistake. I believe that the dust cover was supposed to have something like this to retain the cocking shroud so it couldn't rotate out a battery. I do not know whether this was done in Manchuria, but I believe that's the original intent because this little change would have saved several pieces and a lot of work on the on the cocking shroud.
Sure.
So, all those little changes make this a superior Great War rifle in theory. We'd have to see it in execution, but we know all the armies started looking for dust covers.
Right.
Mud was a problem.
Mud was clearly a problem. That's when the dust cover comes in handy for this guy.
The very fact that they shrouded the cocking piece tells me they must have had problems with mud working its way in there. And if you think about it, that's how you engage on your sear. So you could have a couple problems there. You could have the problem of it jamming up the action so it doesn't fire. Or worse, you could have the problem of it messing with the relationship with the sear and the cocking piece such
and
that
maybe
it holds,
firing when you don't want it to.
Yeah, if it holds the sear down or if the sear there's grit and it rolls over and it just boom, that's a big problem.
Just with all of a sudden pat to the side and it could just go off.
So that setup keeps mud away from your sear arrangement, which is really good. And then there are some improvements in that firing pin to kind of deal with gas mitigation, to deal with potential fouling in the firing pin channel. And then you also have these gas escape holes in the receiver to help deal with any failed casings. Less of a concern if you have good quality ammunition, but like AirSats ammo in World War I, or let's say you're making your own ammo all the way out in the far regions of China, you might not have the best ammo, and you really want a gun that's geared for that.
Situationally, you could change your opinion and maybe want to have this guy.
I'll say, inherently, this gun is a Mauser 98 that has been improved for simpler manufacture, better gas mitigation, and better sealing against mud. Regardless of how it was executed, design-wise, that is exactly what was achieved here. And in those regards, I actually find it to be a very fascinating piece. It's almost the gun Germany should have had, and Austria should have had. But they never did. This is one of those few times where we see like the concept car actually get made. You know, like a prototype that should have been abandoned by the war was suddenly picked up and used. And it's a very sensible prototype, which is never what we see in the war.
No, we really don't.
It's exactly what you would imagine. You would imagine you would go into World War I and they would say, ooh, we got some mud problems. We're going to make some slight adjustments. And they tried to do that. You know, they tried to put dust covers on labels and Berthier's especially.
Oh, yeah.
And it just never seemed to get off the ground because they're throwing everything into the fire and there's no time.
Yeah,
right?
There was literally no time.
And so nothing ever got the attention it deserved. And then one piece out of all these maybes somehow got made in a faraway land. I find that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it's fair.
The boys over at Cogburn have actually been really helpful in this. So I want to say thank you to them.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Thanks to RevWare for letting us borrow that equipment to measure this guy out. And then
super fun to try out.
I will say I'm still kind of committed to trying to work up. If anybody's good at handling like sheet steel and wants to give us a hand here, we have some ideas on what we could do to produce some reproductions of these covers and mark them clearly as such.
No one has them.
Right.
So being able to reproduce some for some sad collectors out there.
There's a few guys out there that would
amazing.
I would like to try my hand at seeing if I could get some made in a way that the collectors could afford if they wanted to fit them to their rifles to kind of have the look. If anybody has those access, by all means reach out. If not, I'll keep probing with what I got. But I'd be curious. I'd like to actually see like a good fit on that. And again, if anybody stumbles across notes on the Austrian 17 prototype, I have very little on that. I'd love to hear an email about that. I'd love to see original drawings, especially if I could maybe prove out my theory about the dust cover retaining that cocking shroud.
Yeah.
But I think that's it, really.
Yeah, I think so. We don't have any executive producers on this Frankenstein, did we?
We didn't have anybody that named this one specifically, but then again, not everybody knew this was coming. We do have an outstanding executive producer of Anthony, who has chipped in for several episodes.
Anthony, thanks, man.
Yep, we really appreciate that.
We
that
do.
is super important right about now.
Very important this summer, fall. I guess now it's fall. When did that happen?
The entire year of 2024 has become something of a quagmire for us here, but we are making our way through, and there will be improvements for 2025.
Yeah, you have those goals you set out where you're like, oh yeah, eventually we're going to acquire land to improve, or we're going to get a bigger studio, or whatever. And we're just doing it all at once.
Or you can make some tentative plans that just collapse and then scramble, and you know what? It'll be better when we're done.
Yeah.
We just got to survive.
We appreciate the support in the meantime.
So thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you, patrons.
All right. I think this guy's covered, right?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
Night, everybody.
Which is exactly what happened. So Mae went to bed. I guarantee you had been asleep for 10 to 15 minutes. And then I had to go bang on the door and be like, you need to get up.
Mm-hmm. And I went,
why?
What? And you
and
went,
I said, the cops are here. They want to talk to you.
I was leaving my room and I went, oh God, somebody's died. They don't come this late unless someone's dead. And then I went, I was maybe halfway down the hallway when I went, wait a minute, did I illegal today? And then I went through my whole day going, no, I didn't illegal anywhere. Oh no, somebody's dead. So like I got back down to the end of the hallway and my brain was like, oh no, who's dead? Who's dead?
Hello? And I hear blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I'm going at 80 miles an hour on the highway and I can't hear you. I'm wearing the wrong helmet. Can you hear me? And it's like, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, no, I'm going to need I need one syllable for yes and two syllables for no, which is confusing, but just give me some syllables because it's all I can make out. I was like, can you hear me? It's like, whoop. And I was like, okay, is this Kyle? And he goes, whoop. And I went, okay, you're going to want to go. And I said the name of the restaurant.
Uh-huh.
Did you get that? He's like, whoop. I was like, okay, go there. It's Taco Tuesday. And then I hear, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I don't know what you said, but if you're asking about David, he's with me.
Yeah, did you call him Charlie Brown or some shit?
I was like, you're a Charlie Brown adult, but I'm pretty sure you're asking me if David's with me, and he is. And then I just heard, whoop. All right, let's see. Same. Different. And then same. Okay, I think we get the idea here. I don't need to cover it any further. Yeah, let's do it anyway. So if we come up to the front, just like the Type 30, we have a front sight driftable. We have, oh, look, this actually has its rod, brass tip.